Hello, everyone. Welcome, friends, and you are our friends wherever you are, whenever you are. Welcome to the Tuesday, March 4th edition, 2025 of the Great Lakes Book Club. I'm very grateful all of you are here today. We have a really exciting time today, but before we get into it, there are a few things I wanted to mention right at the top. The Great Lakes Book Club today will be hosted by myself. My name is Chris Schell. I am the experience manager here at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. If you have been to the National Museum of the Great Lakes anytime in the past few months, you may have noticed we got some construction going on here. Construction here is a part of our very exciting second wave expansion. It is a 5,000 square foot expansion that allows us to tell more of the Great Lakes story and to provide more opportunities to engage in the story of our history, really. I have posted a link in the chat. If you're interested, feel free to explore. Today, however, is our Great Lakes Book Club. The Great Lakes Book Club is a really pivotal part of our continued effort to preserve, share, and celebrate the past, present, and future of the Great Lakes story. And today, I'm very happy to introduce Faith Curry, who is our lead museum educator here at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. She will be our moderator today, asking a few questions. If you have questions for our author, please post them in the chat, and I'll make an effort to ask each and every one of them. But without further ado, let me introduce our author. Our author today has a storied career in higher education and is currently a professor in the Department of English at the State University of New York. He has published and presented on everything from modernist poetry to higher education to international literature to cannabis and much, much more. Our author will be discussing his seventh book. Is that right? Seventh? Yep, seventh book, The Raging Erie, the life and labor along the Erie Canal. Without further ado, everyone put your hands together for Dr. Mark Ferrara.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. Thank you to Chris. Thank you to Faith. Thank you to the Great Lakes Museum for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And there is a phone that I cannot turn off ringing in this office. Sorry, everyone. We're in a trailer because of the expansion, so we're making do with the space we have. And Mark, we're so happy to have you. And I know you have a reading prepared to start off with. Okay,
Yeah,
to
just a short
introduce
reading.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm assuming some of the folks that are online have looked at the book, perhaps read parts of it. I've been doing talks up and down the canal corridor since last year, and I chose a section that I haven't read before in any other event. It seemed appropriate given the fact that it's a book club and that some of us have had a chance to kind of look through the material. So I chose a short 10-minute selection based on that. So hopefully it's suitable to you, but I'm willing in the Q&A and discussion to kind of go to any of the other sections of the book, or if there's other questions about stuff that you saw, or we're just generally interested in, it'd be my pleasure to visit those areas as well. It seems fitting on the cusp of the bicentennial of the completion of the Erie Canal to weigh the impact of that artificial river on American society from the perspective of the 21st century, when the canal is a national heritage corridor, its waters filled with pleasure boats, kayaks, canoes, and commercial craft. Gone forever are the hoagies, the saloons, the glamorous packets, the tow animals, the blacksmith shops, and with them the sights and sounds and smells of real life for millions of ordinary people lost to history, who labored on the docks and in the mills, served on boat crews and repaired vessels, worked in its stores and shops, lodged in its boarding houses, and patronized its restaurants, farmed on its banks and toiled in its factories. The nation was young in 1825, and for many New Yorkers, the canal became a symbol of progress, a model for internal improvement, a testament to advances in transportation and technology, and an exemplar of self-governance and civic participation. It linked the eastern seaboard with the westward expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains, represented a triumph over nature and demonstrated Yankee ingenuity, and confirmed the blessings of liberty and the inevitable march of progress that would make New York the leading state during the 19th century and helped propel the nation to superpower status by the middle of the 20th. The second largest artificial waterway in the world at the time of its completion, only the 1,100-mile ancient Grand Canal in China that linked the northern capital of Beijing with the former southern capital of Hangzhou, was longer. The Erie Canal was so phenomenally successful that New York State expanded it 3 times. First from 1836 to 1862, second from 1884 to 1890, and third between 1896 and 1918. And it constructed a series of lateral canals that provided access to Erie ports from other parts of the state. At its height, the canal system connected Lakes Erie, Ontario, Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, Champlain, and the Hudson, Susquehanna, Allegheny, and Delaware rivers, so that nearly every place of any size in New York was connected to every other by water route. Consequently, chroniclers of the Erie Canal have tended to glorify its design and construction and impact that waterway using language normally reserved for legendary civic leaders and accomplishments of the highest distinction. And maybe you can hear some knocking here. There's some construction going on near me as well. Maybe we can imagine those sounds as sounds that are emerging from the activity along the canal. Generations earlier, the writer and biographer Alan Harlow called the Erie Canal the most audacious adventure in American history, and its construction a greater achievement than was the building of the first railroad through the western mountains to the Pacific coast, of the 1860s. For the author and historian Madeline Wagner, the opening of the Erie and the canal era to which it belonged marked the beginning of a big push westward, the means by which the young nation could fulfill her manifest destiny at the hands of people who were a veritable product of the melting pot of many nations. Nor are contemporary canal chroniclers immune from such hyperbole any more than is the author of this book. That is to say, that the Erie Canal is such a monumental achievement. It's hard to kind of overstate its importance. But what I tried to do in the book was to try to provide a balance to the tendency to romanticize the canal or overly romanticize the canal. And so that's what I was trying to get at in that passage. I think it's a little more clear. I'm reading it from the conclusion of the book here. The historian Carol Sharif argues that the Erie Canal is best seen as a microcosm for important transformations in antebellum America: geographic mobility, government intervention in economic development, market expansion, moral reform, and the reorganization of work at a time when progress meant men and women were taking an active role in realizing a divinely sanctioned movement towards the perfectibility of the natural and human worlds. Best-selling author Peter Bernstein calls the Erie Canal a skinny ditch that would shape a great nation, knit the sinews of the Industrial Revolution, propel globalization, and revolutionize the production and supply of food for the entire world. The writing of these and other scholars which inform this work fill important gaps in our understanding of the origin, construction, impact, and enduring legacy of the Erie Canal. Theirs is a weighty history that celebrates that waterway because it helped profoundly refigure American society. And we'll probably get into some of the ways that that's true during our discussion. Yet the Erie Canal proved a contradictory creation. It brought more democracy via the facility of movement, interconnection of social relations, and new understandings of social reform, but it simultaneously introduced more inequality into 19th century life by way of unequal wealth, social dislocation, and callous treatment of essential workers in and around the canal zone. What often gets lost in celebrations of the politicians, engineers, and business leaders who championed the canal and grew rich from it are members of the poor and working classes who made their lives, for better or worse, frequently worse, along its banks. Many of these people on the razor's edge of progress suffered silently and invisibly, its deepest lacerations. The toil and triumph against nature and overwhelming odds that characterize achievements such as the Erie Canal and the Transcontinental Railroad are central to America's historical imagination, and the nation is tended to praise perceived architects of these technological marvels as visionaries whose work brought the nation bountiful riches and did the Lord's bidding. Most indexes of American history have reinforced this narrative of progress for generations. But if this nationalistic idealism is the historical memory, the historian Ryan Deeringer asserts it's conveniently stunted. What, he asks, of those bodies strained and broke under the load of such glories? What of those people beyond the din and fanfare who appear only in old photographs with faces blurred and indistinguishable? And their lives and deaths in the mud, muck, and mountains is another history of American achievement. These barely visible, oft forgotten, ordinary folk were the true source of economic growth and progress. I'll just do a couple more paragraphs there. The laboring poor and the working class, men, women, and children, blacks and whites, unskilled, semi-skilled, immigrant, and native born, found themselves trapped in an unbridled form of early capitalism, wherein employers exploited these people as cheap labor to plow fields, construct canals and railroads, dig mines, operate machineries in the country's emerging mills and factories. Transient now laborers may have tried to frame their struggles as sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and developed a rough culture of survival, but community members interpreted their reckless behavior in shanty towns and construction camps as evidence of their poor fit for American society. That narrative categorized destitute, transient, and foreign laborers as necessary, but also drunken, violent, unproductive, and uncivilized. Rhetorically, it laid claim to national progress while distancing foreign-born and poor and working-class people from the fruits of their labor. The rise of the canal to national prominence as a means of transportation depended on the menial labor of tens of thousands of people who strung together livelihoods at the economic fringes of society, who left no paper trail, and who endured and were shaped by the soft underbelly of American progress. Across New York and the nation, in taverns and bedrooms, along avenues and on street corners, disenfranchised people socialized, sang, loved, gossiped, primped, promenaded, and fought. Yet, if their capitalist transformation gave rise to new class solidarities, it also fed countervailing forces of patriarchy, nativism, sectarianism, and white supremacy that pulled workers apart as people directed prejudice against one another. White workers used minstrelsy to degrade African Americans. Native-born workers paraded with stuffed patties to antagonize Irish immigrants, and laboring men caroused in a misogynistic sporting culture. Indeed, many forms of civic inequality and national identity emerged out of a deep-seated belief that America was a white Protestant country and that true American citizens were native-born men with Anglo-Saxon ancestors. And I'll do one more paragraph then, if that's okay. I think we're about where we need to be. The Raging Erie represents an attempt to reckon with the violence and pain that permeated the lives of the poor and working classes on or near the Erie Canal. And in doing so, it interprets that corridor from Albany to Buffalo as a realm of trauma as well as triumph, a site of alienation and powerlessness as well as achievement and national progress, a place of proletarianization and exploitation as well as of gradual assimilation and the formation of a collective national identity. The lives of the poor and working classes are often left unsung in accounts of antebellum America. But then again, the very laborers who toiled against great odds to build the canal were left unrepresented in lavish ceremonies representing its completion, including in the grand procession known as the Wedding of the Waters. This is when water was taken from Lake Erie down the canal, down the Hudson to New York City and poured into the waters around the city. The book honors those upon whose backs American progress was built with grueling labor, paid in wages of impoverishment in dangerous and often violent places. I've attempted to give voice to the voiceless lost to time through historical recreations of life on the canal grounded in scholarship, archival research, and the stories of witnesses who testify to the profound transformations wrought on American society by the loss of artisan production and family farming and the rise of industrialization, market capitalism, and unprecedented levels of immigration. So I hope that serves as just a jumping off point for our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you chose, because that's like an unusual choice, like, at the conclusion, but that's perfect for beginning a discussion. And it also is kind of related to the first question I have planned, which isn't specifically about the canal, but is about the same themes. Because something that I had in mind when I started reading the book and as I went through it, was how similar it was to in mid to large size cities all over, but especially I was thinking of Rust Belt cities when the expressways were built from the 50s to the 70s, and whole neighborhoods and communities, mostly of marginalized people, were displaced for that highway system to go through. And it reminded me of that, of we had the same thing over 100 years later in the mid 20th century. And I also thought, I wondered if any of our readers or participants also thought of that as a way that puts you something in modern times, to compare to what was happening. And I wondered, Mark, if you had thought about that and that relationship, because all through that Rust Belt area, we had the expressways displacing similar populations.
Yeah, no, I hadn't really made that connection, but I think it's
Okay.
an interesting one, and it's nice to kind of connect centuries that way. I was particularly struck about what you said about the highway system dividing communities. I've lived in places where I've seen that, and seen the bridges and seen the
Mhm.
other kinds of things that divided people. Um, I think one of the interesting things about the canal is it divides people according to kind of class, in a way that I think is somewhat similar to the example that you use, because you had people who benefited greatly from the canal. So canal boat owners, for example, businesses that were able to ship goods down the canal 95% cheaper than they could
Mhm.
do overland. Um, Tavern owners, farmers whose land was cut through to create the canal, they suddenly had a connection to markets in New York City, westward where you guys are in the Great Lakes,
Right.
and all the way down to the city. But the canal also, I think, brought people together in a way that might not be exactly the same as the highway system,
Mhm.
because we're not cutting communities in half. We're we're building the first boom towns in American history.
Right.
I'm talking about like Rochester and Buffalo, where
The same
suddenly
port
these are
cities where the expressways then split all
well,
those
that's
years
true.
later,
No, that's right.
right?
That's true. That's true. That's right. And I've been traveling up and down the Erie Canal corridor,
Mhm.
for when I was researching the book and then now to do talks. And I saw some of that. I saw highways like around Syracuse, right beside where the canal used to run. So you're right to kind of overlay these two
Mhm.
marvels of our transportation system on top of each other. But I think there was perhaps a building a community building or city building, town building element to the Erie Canal that might not be a
Right.
perfect correlate with the highway system. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I get that. I just as a way for some people to, have something that they use every day to relate to. Yeah. And so I'll go to the beginning of the book when you start the book by kind of putting the reader in that environment of you've got settlers from different places, right? You've got that happening in the French and the Native Americans and Americans, right? They're all these different cultures, and a couple of, who have placed themselves at the top of the hierarchy, right, are the ones trying to make all the decisions. And this is what we discussed a little bit before, but that part of like placing the reader right in that framework at the beginning is what made me think of the War of 1812. And so, you had those conflicts and the battle, for land going on there. And so that's what really got me thinking, like, God, when the Erie Canal stuff started, a lot of these people along the canal path were just a couple years out of a major war. And this war wasn't really won, by either side. It was kind of a tie, and a tie was the best we could settle for, and a lot of these same families, these same regions. So when this happened, you write a lot about how many like impoverished people and marginalized, people were affected by this, and that there were orphans and that there were women without support systems. A lot of this was just a couple years after what some historians, refer to as a civil war, because of the communities. And I wonder if you have thoughts on maybe the increased vulnerability or like tendency to not withstand, what the canal was doing to these communities could have been affected by, were really didn't have time to recover from a war that had taken place in their region, and made the communities more vulnerable.
Yeah, it's a good point. The one way to think about the Erie Canal is that it comes out of a concern that a young nation is starting to grow and expand westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And I know President Washington, George Washington, was particularly concerned, and other politicians as well, and American leaders, that if growth kept continuing west of the Appalachian Mountains and there was no real good way to connect east and west, that you would have a kind of breaking off of what we now would call, Midwestern territories, into separate entities, or perhaps even fall into, the fight with England, or other colonial powers that might be looking to divide or encroach on American territory.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that what makes the Erie Canal unusual is that from Georgia to Maine, in the Appalachian corridor, there's really no other place that's geographically suited for an east-west crossing. And it just happened to be near the site of some of the battles of the War of 1812.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, that war, coming so quickly after the founding of the nation, stopped progress and interest in creating the canal. But then there was a kind of realization, well, wait a minute, we really need to connect east and west. We need to shore up our borders. We need to reassert our sense of nationhood that can be unified on both east and west. And so the fact that the Mohawk Valley, through geography related to the Ice Age, created um, a a possibility for connecting east and west, but you have to overcome like a 600 foot elevation difference through the
Yeah.
creation of lots of locks, and also we might think about the fact that America at this time, like at the middle of New York, like Rome, New York, where the canal was started, this was a remote outpost, not too far from Syracuse for some reference. And then, of course, places like Buffalo and Rochester were way out in the frontier, and these were old growth forests, right, that had to be
Mhm.
cut through. Um, so it was a kind of monumental achievement, but it did um, respond to the War of 1812 and did find a way to connect our country geographically, culturally, and economically.
Hey, thank you for that insight. So I want to just talk a little bit about it culturally. We do have a lot of international visitors here at the museum. We have a German tour operator that's been here like 4 times in the past 2 years with groups of Germans who actually come on Great Lakes cruises and then take a bus from Detroit down to visit us. And
Wonderful.
they are in love with the song, The Erie Canal, right?
Yeah.
All iterations. They especially love Bruce Springsteen. They'll bring him up. And I lived in Germany for a couple
All
years
right.
in the 90s and
Uh-huh.
noticed a similar thing that Germans and Europeans, like continental Europeans, um, are very fascinated with American folk culture and folklore, like the music and things. And so they know about the Erie Canal, they know about the Hoover Dam, they know about the Empire State Building. And I just, it's like a cultural touchstone for us, those things, but also they're the touchstones that Europeans think of in like that glorified, like folk, history manner. And I wonder if you have like opinions or ideas about why something like the Erie Canal is so popular, with people. Sometimes they want to visit. This is kind of the opposite of what we do. Sometimes they come here to visit the places that their ancestors migrated to, the same way that Americans will want to go to see where their ancestors came from. But one of the things that they are very interested in is the Erie um, Canal. And I just wondered if you have like thoughts about that being so culturally, like that's something people in other countries culturally identify the United States with.
Yeah, no, I'm not exactly sure, but I know that we went to England to learn how to build canals because we didn't have engineering schools here at the time the Erie Canal was built. The inspiration for the Erie Canal was taken from other European countries where there
Mm-hmm.
are canal systems. Um, and I think if it lives in the imagination, as suggest of other folks, it may have something simply to do with the massive size of the canal, 663 miles in its original iteration. And that's the largest in the world by far. And so maybe it speaks to kind of a young American ingenuity that people would come to associate with America in later decades and centuries
Right.
as this early kind of massive internal improvement or infrastructure project that suddenly said something about American culture and attitudes, approaches to business, ingenuity, the ability to overcome great difficulties to create
Uh-huh.
something that seemed impossible. And maybe that all gets caught up in kind of ideas of the American dream and American prosperity. Um, and so perhaps there's a kind of connection
I
there.
bet that is too, and especially like the size, because
Yeah.
like if we learned canal, building methods from them, um, so much stuff that we learned there got done on a grander scale
Yes.
here, so that could be like an attraction. That's
Yeah.
good. Thank you. I wanted to know which stories, like during your research, surprised you the most. Like what? Like a lot of us didn't know much of this before we read the book, but you had researched this and a lot. which ones surprised you the most or caught you the most off guard that you learned?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I'll just say something kind of general first, which is my general approach to writing books is that I get interested in a subject and then I want to learn more.
Okay.
And so I usually end up spending 2 to 4 years, researching a book and developing some expertise on it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think um, it's curiosity that kind of propels me forward. And so if you were able to learn something reading the book, I would just say I was learning about the Erie Canal, researching and writing it. And one of the things that really surprised me, there's quite a lot actually, but the extent of child labor on the canal, right? That when we're talking about draft animals pulling boats at 4 or 5 miles an hour, going both ways up and down the canal, there were young children, usually orphan children, who were working 6 hours on, 6 hours off, 6 hours on, 6 hours off, around the clock during the canal season. And so there's a kind of tragic element to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are kids who have lost one or both parents, or alcoholism was a huge issue at this time. This is before the temperance movement, and people along the canal were given whiskey as part of their wages. So you have orphan children not only working and being exploited in that way, sometimes not getting paid at the end of the season when they were supposed to get their wages, finding themselves during the winter months in some unexpected place without, the resources to survive a cold winter. Um, the orphan children who were considered good candidates to be powder monkeys, which are young children who had set explosives when there was the deep cut in the western part of the canal where you're trying to blast your way through the Niagara escarpment. And the fact that so many of these children lost their life dealing with very unstable explosives before there was dynamite.
Yeah.
So to kind of see the extent of child labor along the canal and the way that child labor became necessary even to the family unit in antebellum America because wages, the male breadwinner wage was not large enough
Mm-hmm.
to support a family usually. So you had, women doing piecework outside of the home, maybe taking in
Right.
lodgers. And you would have children maybe collecting scrap metal in the street and bringing it back home to sell, maybe selling newspapers or other kinds of things on the street. So I think that's something we lose touch with today, the extent to which child labor is so much a part of the story of the prosperity of the Erie Canal.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess I don't know if I hadn't read it or I hadn't thought about it much, but how many of those children died, and some of the ones that lived had lost them, things, and we
Absolutely.
didn't have the medical system to care for the ones who lived but were injured. And then I thought, well, I mean, there were just so many children, and if they made it to adulthood, like what kind of trauma are they passing on, right? I mean that had to just last for generations. The fact that those children were used that way. It's very dark.
Absolutely, it is.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and then kind of related to that question, were there things you learned that you had that you thought were right or that you had a conviction in that turned out to be completely wrong when you got into the information?
That's a really good question too, and I appreciate it. I think because of the way I do these projects, like I said, I kind of get interested in stuff and
Uh-huh.
and just kind of research it and learn it. I didn't go into this project with a bunch of preconceptions about what I would find.
So no big
I kind of
surprises.
I don't think so.
All right.
Not and only because I didn't really, have firm convictions about what I wanted to do when I started researching the book. In fact, I didn't know, and so I started traveling up and down the canal corridor, visiting local historical societies, starting to research at Cornell Library and the SUNY
Mhm.
libraries, the New York State Library. And so this all came kind of intuitively and naturally. And so I didn't come to it with expectations or preconceptions, but I was kind of open to letting stories emerge.
Mhm.
And as I started reading books on the Erie Canal and papers on the Erie Canal, I just realized this foreign working class angle was being missed in the
Mhm.
middle of this kind of tendency to say, oh, this is this great historical project, construction project in America before the Civil War. And um, so I think if there was something surprising that emerged, it was that the book found focus by itself around this gap in Erie Canal literature. So rather than going in with the kind of supposition that, oh yeah, I'm going to fill this gap in the scholarship, it just kind of emerged. These
Okay.
voices, these people, just kind of came in a very natural and intuitive way. It's almost sounds kind of hokey to say it, but it's almost like these stories found me,
I
and
think
then I
that's
was able
sweet.
to kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, that I was kind of able to organize them in a way that hopefully is compelling.
Okay. I'm wondering now, because these people were the overlooked part, of the history that a lot of us didn't know about, was it troubling or I don't know, like how was finding oral histories in your research? Because when people aren't overlooked, there's plenty of oral history recorded. How did that go with this?
Yeah, that's another interesting question that I kind of alluded to in my reading. That it
Okay.
is hard to recover voices of people who lived on the margins of society and left very little behind.
Mm-hmm.
So one way you do that is by looking at documents like census records and what those can tell you about certain populations in certain places. You can turn to people who were traveling and working in the area who encountered immigrant canalers building the canal, for example. And so you might not find the voice of the Irish canaler, but you'll often find stories about them from people who were traveling and working in the area. And so that's one way to kind of reconstruct things as well. Um, and so the other thing I do is I start each chapter with a frame story. And
Mm-hmm.
the frame story is usually someone who did reach a kind of level of social prominence enough to leave behind a record. So that makes it a little easier to recreate somebody's story. But these were people that had very humble beginnings.
Right.
And so I was able to kind of use people who had some success or prominence or notoriety eventually in their life, but whose origin and upbringing fit with the poor and working class
I like those
focus.
stories and how they bring it forward,
Oh,
right?
thank
Like
you.
someone who also those particular stories are the ones that also kind of fit the national cultural character, right? The person who overcame and who's right.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. That's right. That's right.
So
Yeah,
that yeah, that's interesting. Um I don't know, it's just overwhelming to think how many people didn't get to tell their story who were affected, right?
absolutely.
What,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Um,
And there are letters and things like that, letters from immigrants back home and things like that where
I wondered about that if
you
there were,
capture some of that. Yeah, so
found
those
some
are
of
really
those.
useful. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
definitely.
And probably the ones that went home were much more likely to survive those documents, right?
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, let's see what I have here. Um, well, first of all, I know this is a stereotypical question, but is there something you want to say or that didn't get asked, something that else that you think is important to mention?
Well, I could mention that I'm working on an article on the Erie Canal right now, and
Oh,
I'm focused on um, Black life along the canal, and so I have a chapter in the book on Black life in the
hmm
canal, along the canal, and I think it does some important things. But as I started thinking about the book, thinking back on the book, I was like, if there's one place I would have liked to have dug in a little bit more, I think it was the Black life along the canal corridor. And then here we're talking about even more marginalized groups than the most marginalized group.
hmm
So among the most marginalized people uh, in a story of marginalization,
hmm
something like that.
That'll be
And
interesting. I'll
yeah,
watch.
yeah,
I'll watch
it's
for the
been.
article.
I'm gonna write it. Spring break is next week, so I'm gonna take that opportunity
Okay.
to write it. I've been doing the research for several months.
All right. So you're probably doing a lot of reading about that particular thing, but I did want to ask, like, what are you reading and what other books like would you recommend, or what's like really standing out for you right now about the subject area that our visitors or we could go to if we do want to know more, in addition to watching for your article to come out.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, that's nice. I think in the introduction and the conclusion of this book, I do mention and engage with the other major Erie Canal books
hmm
that are out
That,
there.
that bibliography is amazing. Like
Oh, thank you.
you don't come across like the notes and bibliography. That was just so well done. I like, to get a nonfiction book and find that wealth of information to dig into.
Thank, thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I do enjoy researching these things. This probably becomes evident as you flip back there and you see all the sources and stuff that
Uh-huh.
I'm using to try to tell the story. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. What about fiction? Have you gotten into fiction about that area
So
subject that you would
no,
recommend?
no, I'm not a fiction writer. Although like all good English majors, I've got some bad poetry from the undergraduate days and some
Uh-huh.
attempts at storytelling and an unfinished novel from when I lived in China.
There you go.
Um, but where I do kind of move into more creative work is what we would call creative nonfiction, which
hmm
covers things like memoir and first person journalism. So the book that I wrote before the Raging Erie is called Living the Food Allergic Life. And it's a kind of it's part memoir about living with a serious tree nut allergy. And
Okay.
I'm using the techniques of fiction to tell a true story. And I think before we were on with the rest of the group, Chris mentioned something about the book that he kind of appreciated the way I was using storytelling techniques in this book.
hmm
So I think your readers may see an approach that's scholarly and grounded in fact, but is still trying to do things like describe character, set scene, work with plot. So while I'm not publishing straight creative writing, poetry, or
Right.
fiction, I am using the techniques of fiction more and more to tell a true story.
Mhm. No, it was very engaging the way you set up each chapter, and also because the way you started with the stories, then you're like kind of looking forward to what's the story going to be for this chapter, as you go through. So that was like a really engaging way to do it. Thank you so
Lovely. Thank
much. I enjoyed
you.
this talk, and I enjoyed even like thinking of the questions. I was so looking forward to this. I think, Chris, do we have people that have questions and comments in the chat you want to share with us?
Yeah, I would love to.
Thank you.
There are a
Thank you.
few, but I also selfishly have some questions. Just some of the to echo your point, Mark, about this, and I said it before the talk, and I have no problem saying it again. What I appreciated is it's it has character, like it has the grit. It doesn't shy away from the human story and creating that human connection in a way that I think is really pivotal in understanding this region at this time and how it relates to today. I had a question. At the top of the talk, I think you mentioned that you leaned against romanticizing the period. And I appreciate that, especially, there's a lot of romanticization about this period of America. And the moment in the novel, I really felt it was like working amazingly. I think you were talking about, were they infected districts? You were talking about this like almost like a cesspool
Yeah,
along the Erie
yeah,
Canal. And
yeah.
I,
That,
as
that's true.
you were doing this research, and compiling all this, these stories and this evidence, were there things that you just couldn't find space for in the book? I mean, you're writing a companion article, like stories you couldn't find space for, or elements of it you didn't quite fully understand, or there's not enough scholarship about yet.
Yeah, I think the Black Life is a good example of that also. It's kind of a place where, I feel like the chapter stands on its own and it does some important things. But I had a question when I was speaking in Lyons, where a gentleman came up to me and he was asking about, well, what kind of black workers are working to construct the canal, right? And then that question just kind of triggered something in my mind where I was like, oh, that's a really interesting question because I mean, the short answer to that question is that the first few years of the Erie Canal, it was local contractors were hired up and down the canal corridor. And so it was like local farmers and people who had had some experience digging ditches and farming and things like this. And then after about 2 years of early canal construction, we start to get this boom of immigration from Ireland, especially. And so then when you look at sources on the Erie Canal, like you go to a Wikipedia page or something, they're going to say the Irish immigrants built the canal. And so that's the kind of standard answer. And then the question is, well, where do black, unskilled, semi-skilled, or skilled labor fit in here? And it's kind of hard to locate. And in part because of the kind of persistent racism in the antebellum era that is kind of always marginalizing and displacing Black workers. So you see them cooking on boats, you see them in service industries and hotels along the canal, you see them doing, you know, labor in mills, for example, at Portside, barbering, selling stuff on the street. But once the Irish come in, um, a lot of Black workers are displaced from those menial jobs because there was a strong preference to have white workers, even though, as we probably know, the Irish were, a kind of despised immigrant group for a long, long time, and there was a lot of like anti-Irish, anti-Catholic sentiment. But employers would still prefer, a foreign immigrant that was white, and so then it became increasingly hard for African Americans along the canal to even do the kind of scut work they were doing before. So I think I that was really kind of surprising and shocking. And that's why I'm going to spend next week kind of trying to write this up. Um, because we have this, maybe some of us have a tendency to think, oh, New York, we didn't have a lot of slavery up there. They were quick to get rid of it. And actually, that's not true. We were actually pretty slow. And there was all kinds of lingering consequences of racism throughout the early part of the antebellum era. I hope that gets at something you were
Well, yes, and we'll just have to read the article to come to really full. I mean, I echo Faith. I'm looking forward to, I hope your spring break is productive because that sounds really
Thank you so much.
fascinating. I have
Thank
a
you.
question directly from the chat, which I hadn't really thought about, but is really interesting. This is from Andrew Cole, who writes, connecting this book to our region of Ohio. In 1913, a great flood essentially ended the commercial use of Ohio and Erie Canal here in Ohio. Did you
Oh,
find
okay.
any impact of this event on the Erie Canal in New York? It seems that there was lateral expansion in New York even beyond this date, so perhaps it was not a large roadblock.
That's an interesting question. That is a great question. Thank you for that. I did run across the Ohio and Erie Canal references. In fact, one of my chapters starts with it. So it is an important lateral canal. It does a lot of important things. Um, and so it does kind of get referenced. But the question is focused on the early 20th century. And so one thing we would just kind of back up a little bit and say the original canal was expanded almost right away. Um, and it went from 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep to 70 feet wide and 7 feet deep. And it reached its peak in the 1850s. And then you start having railroads come in and it starts to take away freight service, especially passenger service still continues. And then from the 1850s, traffic and stuff kind of dwindles on the canal, but it continues. But in the early 20th century, there's the expansion of the Erie Canal into the barge canal. And I think that's 120 feet wide and 12 feet deep, I think, if memory serves. Um, and so by that time, probably the connections with the barge canal to the Ohio Erie Canal become kind of less important than they were in the antebellum era. That would be my best try at answering that question. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I have another follow-up question from
Sure.
Thomas in the chat. Could you briefly explain the construction of the canal? You know, the gravel, the stone, etc., things of that nature.
I could do a little bit of that. Yeah, sure. So, if you can picture New York State in your mind, and you can kind of know where Syracuse is, near Syracuse is a place called Rome, and construction started in Rome in 1817, and it was like I mentioned earlier, it was kind of a remote outpost. There's not much happening there. It's pretty small, and so it seems like an odd place to start digging a canal. But the advantage was that it's very flat around there, and you could fairly easily dig the first parts of the canal without having to put in locks or aqueducts or anything like that. And so the advantage is you actually get to get in there, learn how to cut into the ground, learn how to build the embankments on which to towpath, learn how to use the waterproof concrete, learn how to deal with animals burrowing into banks and getting leaks, experiment with feeder canals that can keep the water running. And so in the first couple of years, we have connections between Rome and Utica, and then Rome to Syracuse. And it's very flat and kind of fairly easy to construct compared to the eastern and western ends where you really have a lot of difficulty. And so it was successful even before it was completed, because even though it was regional and small, it really did facilitate the transportation of people and products and ideas up and along the canal. So that first phase lasts 2 years, 2 to 3 years, and it's experimental, but they took the easiest part first and kind of were able to solve, some problems that they would have to encounter later. Then the eastern portion, say from Utica, Syracuse area down to um, Troy, Albany area, now you're talking about hundreds of feet. Um, you're talking about crossing Mohawk River and trying to find parts of that could be used, and then creating a canal to kind of augment them. And uh, even towards the end, as you're getting towards Albany and Troy, there's a whole series of locks that have to happen in quick order. So that was difficult stuff. And then the western part was even worse because you eventually get to the Niagara escarpment. So you're trying to get up, you're up high in Buffalo and you're down low. And so you have to get boats up 600 feet over 300 miles. And so this is when they had to blast through the limestone rock to create this big, deep cut that was miles long. And so a lot of kind of accidents and deaths and suffering happened during there. And then I guess in between, I didn't mention the Montezuma marshes, which were also really places of sickness and illness for workers who had to wade, waist deep in muck as they're trying to get a canal corridor through there. So just a kind of short answer would be three phases. The easiest phase first, then the eastern corridor with the locks, and then finally the western section that required, some of you may know Lockport with a flight of five locks back to back. So lock, 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 lock. So that was an engineering marvel. And then on the other side of that is the great cut, the deep cut that has to happen. So um, that's why, some people, Thomas Jefferson most famously, was skeptical of the ability of New York State to actually successfully make this 363-mile canal.
Thank you for that. We have one last question, which will sort of segue as we wrap things up here at the end of the hour. I've gone ahead and placed a few links in the chat. One is directly from the publisher. If you haven't already purchased a copy of The Raging Erie, one of the best places to get it is from the publisher. We also carry the book here at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. So if you want your first copy, your second copy, your third copy, as many copies as you want, feel free to pick them up. But one of our guests in the chat mentioned that they really enjoy have a question about if there would be an audiobook version of the book to come. And I guess that segues into what is the future of the Raging Erie and what is the best way for people to support you, Mark?
Thank you so much, Chris. Yes, well, I just got news 2 or 3 weeks ago that Columbia University Press has decided to make an audiobook version. So they've hired an actor and it should be out this summer. So yeah, that was so amazing. So thank you. Yeah, so stay tuned for that. And I appreciate the question about support. I'm not on social media or anything like that. And I have been giving talks up and down the canal corridor, but I'm not great at self-publicizing my own work. So if anybody in attendance today liked the book, if you might consider leaving a review on Amazon, that would be a great contribution to the success of the book.
Absolutely. And look for the article to come in the future.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make sure
do.
you get that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm serious. Please do.
Thank you so much.
The last little piece of housekeeping that we have is about the next Great Lakes Book Club, Mark. So I hope that's okay that we shill the next one as they go.
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed our Great Lakes Book Club so far, as I have, we would love to have you back. Mark, you're obviously welcome to return. Next month, and I've placed a link in the chat to our events page and a link to the book for next month with Faith we'll tell you about before we wrap up.
All right. I want to thank Mark again for coming. This was such a great experience. We've really put more effort and intention into our book club this year that we want to continue going forward. And this was a great experience and an example of what we'd like them to be. Our next book is called The Salmon Capital of Michigan, The Rise and Fall of the Salmon Capital of Michigan. I don't have the copy to hold up with me. I think it's on my desk, Chris. Thank you. There we go. The Salmon Capital of Michigan, The Rise and Fall of a Great Lakes Fishery. It is about Chinook salmon fishing that had a really great period there on the coast of Michigan for years, but then because of environmental and business changes, that went down. And so it's by Carson Pritchard, and he collected a lot of oral histories in his research for this book. He talked to a lot of people who had been part of it or who had been children of people who were part of it. And it was very interesting to me because we hear a lot of like fisheries stories that take place like more in the upper Great Lakes or on the East Coast. And this is like right here in a small Michigan town, you know, like just up the road practically. And so it's a very interesting story of how entire community can be affected and how the community's main business can change over time from industry to tourism to fishing to back to a different kind of tourism to boating. And a lot of people I know that come to the museum regularly and who attend book club, you know, have been in, to visit coastal Michigan. And so I hope that you'll join us for that book. That one's published by Wayne State University Press. And Mark, if you can remember to send me a link when your article is published, I can make a history post on our socials about here's
Thank you.
this history thing, and then I can link to the article. So if people who are attending want to, you know, keep up with our Throwback Thursday posts or our education posts, I'll do that.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for coming. And thank
Pleasure
you
to be here.
everyone for
Thank you.
attending. And we hope to see you in April.
Yes, come back next month, purchase the book anywhere. I just included a link to Amazon, review it everywhere. It'd make a great St. Patrick's Day gift. It'd make a great gift for anyone for any reason. Mark, thank you again.
The Irish.
Thank you for
The Irish, yes. The Irish
yes.
tie-in.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Jordan.
much.
Yep.
Yep. Yes. Yes. The honestly, everyone just stock up now because you'll never run out of reasons to have this book. But thank you very much, Mark. It's been a
Thank you,
delight.
Chris. Thank you, Faith. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Take care.